So please, say who you are, please.
Well, you heard earlier, I am Omar, retired science advisor Malaysia, not a former science advisor. I want to just comment from the science advice to a prime minister from the context of a developing country. Your job is easy or otherwise, depending on the openness of the prime minister to science and technology. And I was very lucky to serve a prime minister who strongly believed in the crucial role of STIA in development. So it's not difficult to sell him ideas in relating to science and how it can help the development of Malaysia. The channels are open to me was through the formal channel, the Ministry of Science, National Research Council, and Academy of Sciences, and so on. But the most useful was what you have been referring to now as informal. I don't like the word informal because it sounds too laissez-faire. I rather use the term non-formal. And through the non-formal ways, we could achieve quite a lot. The formal way has got to go through so many layers. And as Sir Peter said, the non-formal way goes straight to the Prime Minister's ears. By the way, I served as a science advisor for 16 years with only one Prime Minister. But 4 chief secretaries to the government. So my advice for those who wants to become science advisor is to choose your prime minister carefully.
So I will just ask, I mean, if anyone wants to say anything specific, then do, but I do have a question as a result of that question, which is if anyone wants to talk about how they turned a non-receptive prime minister into a receptive prime minister, that might be interesting. Nope?
Receptive Prime Minister, but I think the issue is very real, and whether it's a Prime Minister or ministers or chiefs of staff, the senior people that matter at the heart of government, they do change, and even with any one administration, the personalities are very, very different. And I think that the job cannot be done if you demonstrate scientific hubris, if you try to enter into their space, but you've got to be sensitive to their space. You've got to be apolitical, but at the same time sensitive to their political needs. And I think it just requires the kind of person or skill set to be able to work with multiple personalities and just change your approach. For me, the core people are the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, the head of the Cabinet Office, and the Minister of Science and Technology and the Minister of Finance. They're all very different personalities. They all need to be approached in different ways, and yet you need to be friends with all of them.
Let's move on, and then we can come back to these questions if we run out of questioners. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I wish to again equally congratulate Sir Peter for this opportunity. And I am actually the Dean of the Faculty of Science in my university in Cameroon, and I'm representing the Cameroon Academy of Sciences here. I am a science advisor to the Academy on issues of climate change and natural hazards and disasters. And occasionally, the presidency of the country contacts me for advice on volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, which are common disasters in my country. I have actually learned a lot, but I would like to make a comment and then ask a question. The comment is, what are governments? When we say science advice to governments, from the lectures I've heard, from the presentations, I see governments ranging from the presidency, the prime minister's office, the minister, the parliamentarians, and all sorts of people in power who can take the advice from the scientists and use it for the betterment of the society. But is it in all cases that such advice is utilized the way the scientists put it? Or are there times that because of political leanings, this information is distorted before it gets down to the population? Is that possible? That is a question I would like to know. Secondly, we heard from Romain that citizens need to understand the basic issues they are facing, especially in times of crisis. We in Africa will have a crisis of Ebola, which is touching the whole world. And last week, the British government offered 65 million pounds for research leading to a cure. My Vice Chancellor sent me a note on that, and I sent it to the experts who have lapsed to look for this cure. But after having attended this meeting, I realized one thing, that for the first time, we have science advisors from all over the world, a cream of them. I don't know if they have ever met before. And it is always understood that prevention is better than cure. If out of the 65 million pounds, 5 million pounds was allocated to all the science advisors here to sit down and advise the 3 countries or 4 countries which are affected, and the neighboring countries like Cameroon, which we are so scared of, wouldn't that go a long way to save more lives than just waiting to get a cure for Ebola? I don't know if this is not possible. I'm not asking for an answer, but I was just wondering whether this could not be a better option, because I do understand that the British government must have given the 65 million pounds based on the science advice they got from the advisors. Well, if that's not the situation, I'm sorry, I can withdraw that. But the victims are now being huddled, families have been separated, people have been separated, they are being used like sheep, guarded in pockets. I don't know whether that's the advice of the science advisor of the governments of the country concerned, or it is based on the advice of the military, who are making sure that some of these people are separated from others. In my country, before I left last week, my Vice Chancellor asked me to put up a team of Ebola Prevention Committee, which I did. We got medical doctors from the School of Medicine and practicing doctors, and we came up, had several meetings, and put up some videos. And right now, this week, they are about going from town to town, advising people, even on radio. And I've had appreciations, Twitters from US and Britain, from those who have received that and said that was a very good thing to do. Why? Because lack of understanding of the disease has caused a lot of crisis. There was a situation, sorry, I have to cite it so that you know the reality in Africa. There was a situation in a market in a border town between Nigeria and Cameroon where somebody suffering from malaria had high temperatures. And it is known that the first symptom of Ebola is high temperature. So this guy went to the hospital to say, I have Ebola, I have Ebola. The medical doctors and the nurses escaped. They wouldn't attend to him. But when he was finally attended to, they realized that it was only malaria, it wasn't Ebola. Another situation, somebody went to a market square in the morning, started shouting that he had Ebola, 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 and everybody took off and abandoned him in the market. And of course, this was a very clever thief. So he stole a few things, put in a bag, and went home. And it is because of that that my Vice Chancellor was proactive. And what she did by asking us to set up a committee and advise people was going against the policy of the country. Because the policy of the country is that in case of crisis, experts' advice should go through the governor, to the prime minister, to the presidency, who will now send information to the Minister of Information, who will go on the air and advise on what to do. So after second thought, and as Romain said, what we did was useful at the time because it couldn't wait. So my worry now is, what am I taking home? Am I going home knowing that all these science advisors from all over the world will convince their governments to put together some 10 million pounds and put them together to think tank and advise? Because Ebola has no political boundaries. One Spanish is already dead, one European. Well, we don't know how many will die again. The screening, what can we do to screen people when they travel? So thank you very much for the opportunity.
You wanted to say something?
So I will try and answer. Thank you. I'll try and answer your questions. So first of all, on governments, I am the scientific advisor to the government of Ireland. That means that I have access to all government ministers. When that was announced, the opposition immediately objected because they wanted access to me as well. And it was very clear that I could be accessed by anybody who wanted to know anything about science, whether they were within government or not. And so I speak often to members of political parties that are not in government. But I am always extremely careful that I either inadvertently or deliberately do not give them anything which would allow them to criticize the government. I'm always very clear that the advice is the same irrespective of who is asking for it. Without question, they always ask me whether there is something that I'm unhappy about that they could do for me. And without question, I always answer saying, no, I'm very happy and I can look after myself, thank you very much. So I think the question is an important political question because you need to understand that not everybody is seeking the advice simply for the answer. They may be seeking it for a political purpose. And I think if you're going to give it widely, which I support, you have to be cognizant of that and you have to be very, very consistent and you have to be very, very careful, which is difficult, not to either inadvertently or deliberately give anybody the opportunity to use it in a political way. So that would be the first comment. The second comment on Ebola I would make is that I actually understand how severe a problem it is, but actually it's a very good example of how people have come together because announced today, the British pharmaceutical company GlaxoSmithKline is launching a phase 1 trial for a vaccine to prevent Ebola, jointly funded by the Medical Research Council, BBSRC, the NIH, and others. It will have 40 volunteers in Oxford. It will have 40 volunteers in Washington at the NIH. Neither of those communities would normally be expected to be exposed to Ebola. And if the phase 1 safety trial is safe, it will then be trialed in 3 months' time in various places in Africa. And I make that point deliberately because what it shows is two things. One, a cooperation between GlaxoSmithKline and the public funders. And number two, that the safety studies are not being conducted in Africa. They're actually being conducted in the West, so that there can be no allegation that people in a crisis, there's no doubt about that, are being used as a guinea pig. The safety data will be done in America and in Britain, and then if it's appropriate, will be rolled out into Africa, and if that works, and there's a big if there because it's a piece of science, then people like the Gates Foundation and so on will step in. So I think it's really important in these crises that people step up, and I use that example because I think it's a wonderful example of where a pharmaceutical company, international funding agencies have come together to try and develop a vaccine which would prevent against Ebola, and actually where the people who are going to test the safety of that vaccine have probably an infinitesimally low probability of ever contracting Ebola in their lives. So it's a very small step in what is a very big problem, but I do think it's in the right direction.
One more comment. Remy?
Yeah, maybe on Ebola, just a little detail, but I was called 2 weeks ago by the mayor of the city of Montreal, and you're talking about big city, and basically say, well, can you help us in planning? Because it may or it will happen. So there again, just at the level of city, yes, cities, provincial government, but national government, we need to collaborate, we need to interact with the rest of the world, but even starting at the level of city is very important.
Next question. All right, very quick.
So there was one aspect. Oh, there's one aspect to your question that wasn't answered, which was, do governments sometimes distort or ignore scientific advice? And yeah, the answer is of course yes. And this is why when you have any kind of formal or written science advice, if it's at all possible to share it with the public, to post it online, it's incredibly important so the public can then hold the government officials accountable for the way in which they responded to the advice.
2 more questions and that'll be it.
For 2 days we've been discussing evidence-based policymaking and how to bring good science to the process. In trying to draft a proposal how to do this, I was struck by the difficulty in finding evidence for the scientific advisory systems that exist anywhere. And it's, since I would like to base my proposal on evidence, I would be grateful for any hints to critical evaluations of science advisory systems, how they function, what are their pros and cons, and what is their cost effectiveness. And of course, the second and more important question is whether governments who have a well-functioning science advisory system make better decisions than those that do not have so.
Okay, so that's an invitation for a lecture, but nevertheless, Peter, I don't know, Peter, look at, and also Brian, I know, wants to say something, and then we'll see what happens.
I think the difficulty is the different kinds of modalities of science advice. Perhaps the most difficult science advice to assess is going to be the advice that's informal by definition, and within that advice, the most useful advice you sometimes give is don't do that, Prime Minister. In other words, the stuff you stop rather than the stuff you start. And how you assess that, because of the counterfactual issue, is it seems to be hard. Clearly, that you can assess various forms of formal advice in terms of what happened, but they still have to be put into the context of the reasons why they failed. As Heather has pointed out briefly in her comment, science doesn't make policy. Science informs policy. And there will be situations when science advice is explicitly or implicitly rejected in making policy. That's normal, normative, whatever. And it's quite right in a democracy. In the end, governments make their decisions in a democracy on a whole host of factors, of which the knowledge base is one. I think one of the problems we have in this whole area, and I think many scientists who are not engaged regularly in the science advice process don't appreciate, is scientific hubris. Many scientists assume science makes evidence. They assume science generates a bit of knowledge, with caveats around the fact that Heather has written about so well, need to be taken into account, and if you haven't read her blog today, you all should. But the point is, beyond that, science is just one factor in the range of things and the knowledge base that governments have to use. Some things are self-evident, you would think. Putting fluoride in water to reduce tooth decay would seem self-evident based on the evidence. Only half the governments of the Western world do it in areas or in regions of where they would need to do it, because there are strong philosophical and other objections coming from parts of the community. And governments at some point know they're going to be voted out. They don't want to do it over the thing, so you can say, well, it's only dental health. But in fact, if you look at the cost of poor dental care, it's an enormous cost. So on any rational economic or scientific ground, you would put fluoride into everywhere there's low levels of fluoride in the water, you'd put fluoride into the water. But around the world, governments don't do it. We've even had a situation in Israel recently where, on purely philosophical grounds, a minister tried to have it removed. Didn't work, but because others opposed it. But the point I'm making is that's just a simple example of the reality that science advice will never. The only situation where it changes, almost inevitably, is in the emergency. And I think Mark Wilbert yesterday pointed out so well, at the time of emergency, science advisors become part of the decision-making process as well as the advisor. That's a very distinct situation that's different.
Two things. One, the Government Office of Science, which Sir Mark is in charge of, and I don't think he's in the room. I know because I was in the network of chief scientific advisors under his predecessor, Sir John Beddington, that we regularly did reviews of the use of science in every government department, and it was a mixture of an internal team, and I had the privilege of being on some of those teams, with external academics, both national and international, and the reports of those reviews, which were done about every 3 years or so, were made public. Now, they quite often, in our government, our democratic system, when the government changes, things that the previous administration had done are put in the National Archive. And as I was saying about the speed of digital technology, it goes into the National Archive extremely quickly now, like about a day. So there's no history, although it is accessible. It's much harder to find. So perhaps afterwards, if you could just get a card from me, I can point you at where that work is being done. Second example, which I've actually put on the blog for this event, is an academic paper that was written by a political scientist in Exeter University, a lady called Claire Dunlop, where she described Sir Bob Watson, who was the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA, Chief Scientific Advisor, and myself, what we did on that biofuel saga that I mentioned before. It's the first time I've been the subject of an academic paper rather than the author of an academic paper. And that actually describes the brokering function that we collectively between us achieved between scientists, commercial activity, government policy, both nationally and internationally, and how that worked. So there is a paper which is on the source material pages for this event, which you could pull off, and that is another example.
This morning, the Roger Pelkey mentioned that is very important. There is no one-size-fit-all solutions. Advisory mechanism and advisory processes reflecting every country, reflecting and local areas reflecting the cultural history and the political systems. So we need not only the discussion, those kind of the science advisor level, but also the global comparative studies by academicians. Okay, thank you.
Last question. Thanks for your patience.
Jeffrey Bolton, Royal Society. We've been talking about operationalizing scientific advice, and the bodies represented at the table, and indeed those that are involved, all of them formal bodies within and without government. Heather Douglas talked about the fundamental role of engagement with the public in the business of creating public policy. But particularly in an era when we have instantaneous communication, to which very few bodies have, formal bodies have really adapted as fully as arguably they need to or have the capacity to. Of course, it's true that irrespective of the strength of scientific advice, the real constraints on politicians' willingness to generate policy in particular domains is public knowledge, public values, public priorities. Are there any ways, do you think, in which we ought to be moving to operationalizing public input into policy creation based on scientific advice?
So I'll have a go at that. I would say there have been a number of interesting experiments. The Danish experiment on the Inno Plus scheme, where they essentially asked the public what research they wanted done. The New Zealand experience with their grand challenges, where they asked the public what research they wanted done. The New Zealand experience actually asking school children and school teachers what STEM education they wanted, which I think is particularly innovative. We're about to do a very similar thing in Ireland to actually ask people what they want in terms of scientific knowledge, and you would be surprised, okay? So scientists have a very different view. I sometimes run breakfast briefings for Irish TDs, for members of Parliament, and you know what they request is usually the hot topic that they're currently considering. So I've done septic tanks, water meters, you know, fracking, all that kind of stuff, and that's really the political reality that people want to know. That I think it's very important to take a similar sampling from the public, who often have very different ideas about what they might want research on.
Heather.
So happily, there's actually a lot of research on public engagement techniques. I wrote a paper in 2005 called Inserting the Public into Science, which surveys some of that terrain. James Wilsden edited a collection in the Public Understanding of Science and Public Engagement Techniques with Jack Stilgo and John Locke. No, can't. Yeah, someone. In 2014, there's an entire book online at the National Academies of Sciences called Public Engagement in Environmental Assessment by Stern and Dietz that you can download the entire 200-some pages of examples of how to do this. So there's a great deal of research by social scientists on how to engage the public in ways that doesn't just turn into shouting matches. It involves mediators. You can do either stakeholder engagement, or you can do random sampling like a citizen jury, and there are various techniques that can be employed. I actually personally think that in the formal science advising structures that we've been examining, it would be probably quite effective to have an ongoing citizen jury technique attached to those things to provide input to both the framing of the issues and the assessment of the sufficiency of evidence, and that would be something that could just be part of what one does as a citizen as an ongoing basis, and be probably very successful in both raising the credibility and acceptability of the advice in the public and bringing science to the public in a way that's very understandable, because you have to create briefing documents for these things that convey information very clearly. And so I'm actually very optimistic about being able to do that.
Okay, I think we've reached the end. So please thank the panel. And a 15-minute break. Peter.